Hello and welcome back. This is the week 6 lecture. So now that we have finished our descriptive narratives, we move on to our next writing genre or our next style of writing, and that is, of course, analysis. So this week, I just want to cover the basic concepts of this writing genre. We can get some definitions down, we can start practicing, and just sort of get a good feel for how analysis works. Like narrative and like description, this might be a term analysis that we're already familiar with. We've probably heard it before. In my experience, students often hear teachers use this word, and they might even be given assignments that include the word, or they might be told to analyze something. But it's not always 100% clear what that means, what analyzing something actually means, what it is, how do we do it, why are we doing it, why does it matter, why should we care? So I'll try to answer a few of those questions today. We'll cover the basics, and then next week, in week 7, we will get a little more specific and we'll start talking about process analysis, which is a particular type of analysis, and that's what we will ultimately be doing in Essay 2. So before we get into all of that, though, I just want to say something very quickly about Essay 1. I won't spend very much time on this, but I just want to recommend that you guys write a brief reflection now that you have submitted Essay 1. I actually recommend that you do this after every major essay assignment. It's not a big production. You don't need to look at it as a formal assignment because it very much is not. I will never ask you to turn these in. These are just sort of like journal entries that you can record after you've turned in one of our 4 major essays. Just kind of reflect on what went well on the assignment, what maybe didn't go so well, what are some things that seem to work for you, and then also what do you need to improve upon next time. Think a little bit about the writing process since we talked about that at length last week. Think about your own personal writing process. What worked for you? Did you engage in some of those idea generation activities that I shared with you? Did you find those helpful? How about the outline? Did you do an outline? Did you find that helpful? Did it help you with the drafting? Did you leave yourself enough time to complete a finished to put together a complete rough draft? Did you have enough time to conduct our post-writing steps? Did you revise? Did you edit? Just think about all of that. It really is helpful. And I encourage you guys to start really thinking of yourselves as writers. At least as long as you are in this class. We are all writers for at least this semester. Even if you don't like writing, even if you don't think you're very good at it, you are a writer right now. So you need to record your experiences with all of these major essays. That's a learning tool. Once you record your experiences, you can take the good, you can learn from the bad, you can look back later and sort of track your progress. Track your development as a writer. If you actually follow my advice, you'll have 4 of these reflections by the end of the semester. And if you go back and read through them, it'll sort of be a narrative of your growth and development as a writer in this class. At least that's the goal. It doesn't always work that way, but that's what we want. Okay, so that's just something you can do before jumping into the next unit. But let's go ahead right now and jump into the next unit. So, analysis, a basic skill necessary for all college students, regardless of your major or your area of interest. So the word analysis actually comes from an ancient Greek word for undo. So that's how I kind of want you to think about this particular writing style. When we analyze, what we're actually doing is we are breaking something down into all of its individual parts or elements. And then we examine all of those individual parts and elements. We understand what they are individually, and we come to understand the relationships between all of those individual parts and elements. And once we do that, we're ready to reassemble, to rebuild the thing that we're analyzing. And in the process, we've sort of arrived at this greater understanding of what the thing is, how it works, and why it's important. And once we acquire that knowledge, we'll be able to sort of draw our own conclusions, and we'll be able to share the knowledge and our original conclusions and interpretations with our larger audience. So that's the ultimate goal. So I want you to have this visual image of taking something apart, examining all of its individual parts or elements, and then reassembling it back into its sort of complete wholeness. But in so doing, you've arrived at a greater understanding. So this works really well for mechanical objects. Those of you who are mechanically inclined, this is a great thing to do with engines or computers or any sort of complex device. This can work well for everyday items, but the great thing about analysis is we can use these basic skills to explore and understand anything. So we can literally analyze anything. Mechanical objects. We can analyze written texts, like the narratives that we've been reading. We can analyze people. We can analyze historical events. We can analyze geographical places. Movies. I have a movie, I know you can't see that, but that's what I'm gesturing toward. Movies, TV shows, whatever. Food, sports, literally anything under the sun can be analyzed. So this is a really applicable set of skills that we're going to be learning over the next few weeks. That's really part of what makes it so important, because you can translate these skills to any walk of life, any academic subject, any future class that you might take, and it also applies to a lot of workplace situations. So if we sharpen our analytical skills, we become more perceptive. We become more knowledgeable, of course, but analysis allows us to sort of see beneath the surface of things. We're able to understand the inner workings of things. And we can start to arrive at more original conclusions, more original interpretations based on the knowledge that we've gained. And again, these are universal skills. They're essential to all forms of college learning and learning beyond college. So it doesn't matter whether you're discussing literature, or you could be perhaps reviewing a psychology experiment or a biology experiment or approving a loan application. These are all different things, but we can use analysis to help us do all of these things. So the skills of analysis really are broad, they're universal, and they're just obviously they're very useful things to know. So, what I want to start with today is just a couple of really sort of basic definitions. And you'll see these in the Week 6 overview. If you guys aren't there yet, go ahead and enter Web Campus, go to Week 6. You'll see some of those examples that I've posted that we'll get to later. But if you go into the overview, as usual, you'll see our notes. So be sure that you understand the difference between the subject of analysis and the principle or framework of analysis. These are the two key terms that I want us to sort of think about today. The subject of analysis is simply going to be your topic. It's going to be the thing or the person or the event, the text, the movie, whatever. Whatever it is that you're analyzing, that is your subject of analysis. So again, think of it like the topic that you chose for your narrative. The topic of the narrative was different than the narrative sequence or structure of the narrative. It was different than the theme or overall narrative point found in the narrative, right? So just keep those distinctions in mind. The topic is usually sort of a general, broad thing. It's just the thing that we're writing about. Don't get that confused with the principle or framework of analysis, which is a lot more complex and there's a lot more sort of moving parts. So the principle or the framework of analysis, I like to use the word framework, that's kind of part of the definition, but we can also just call it a framework. This is our structure. This is the way that we are actually going to conduct our analysis. So if I choose as my subject of analysis, let's say a car, then my framework of analysis is going to be based on a few things. Obviously, it's going to be based on the car itself. Everybody's subjects will eventually be different. But if I'm mostly interested in how a car goes, like how a car moves, if that's what I want to understand and communicate to my audience, then I'm going to probably focus on all the key parts or individual elements of the car that are a part of the car's sort of locomotion, this sort of part of what makes the car go. So obviously the engine, whatever's involved in the internal combustion, I don't know much about cars, but maybe the steering wheel, the gas pedal, those might be important to discuss too. But when I'm identifying all the key individual elements or parts, that's in large part how I'm assembling my framework. I'm identifying all the things that I need to explore, all the individual parts of the car that I need to explore. And then as I explore them and as I determine sort of their relationships between each other, that's going to be the substance, that's going to be the content that really fills up my framework. So the framework is largely based on the individual elements or parts that you want to examine, explore, and explain. So, again, this will depend on your topic. This will depend on your subject. But it's really important, and I want to make sure we get this today. We're looking at individual elements. That's always our goal. It doesn't matter what we're analyzing. So even though we can analyze anything, our basic procedure, our basic techniques, the way that we analyze will often sort of follow the same model, this same kind of course. We're going to identify all the important parts, and then we're going to really dig into those individual parts or elements. And that's really going to, like I said, create most of our content, most of our substance. So that's what we're doing. So just a couple of quick ways to get started with this. A couple of things that you can analyze very quickly as you're watching. You can also pause me. These are just a couple things I threw out to my live classes earlier in the week. How about a bicycle? Okay, so if you want to explain how a bicycle works, if you want, again, that's our goal with analysis. We want to break it down and then reassemble it in order to understand what it does, how it works, and why it's important. So let's imagine that you have a friend from Mars who's new to Earth and is not familiar with bicycles. So the bicycle is obviously your subject of analysis. Your framework is going to be based on what you think is most important about the bike and what makes the bike do its most important function, which is transport people on it, much like a car. So you're going to identify all the most important parts, the pedals, the handlebars, the wheels, right? And whatever else seems important. And it's going to be your discussion and your explanation of those parts and how they work together. That's really going to sort of be the main body of your analysis. That's going to become your framework. The framework is just how are you going to do this thing that we're trying to do? How are you actually going to conduct the analysis? So when you're thinking about your subject of analysis, you need to have it in your mind sort of, okay, what does this thing do? Or like, what's important about this thing? And once that's in mind, and that's usually pretty obvious, then that will help guide you when you're creating your framework. So I want to focus on what makes a car go. maybe I'm not really going to talk to my Martian friend all that much about windows or seatbelts, although they are important. But if my framework is geared towards really explaining the motion aspect, then that's how I structure the framework. Those are the parts I'm going to examine, and those are the relationships I'm going to explore. And I know my ultimate goal is to explain that larger function, that motion of the car. So once we know our subject and we know what our subject does, the next step is to assemble our framework by identifying the key elements or parts, and then we just have to really dive in and explore those key elements or parts. So another thing you can try right now, something easy, an apple pie. Think about an apple pie for a moment. We know the basic function of an apple pie. It is to be a dessert and to taste delicious. And we know that there are several individual parts that go into the pie. There's the apple filling, there's the crust. I believe there should be ice cream on top. But there's even more. We can get even more specific than that. How do we make the crust? What's the, how much butter? What are all the other ingredients that are going into it? There are different kinds of crusts. There might even be different kinds of apple fillings. So we can be very minute and very specific depending on what our ultimate goals are and what we're trying to explain about our subject. But we can all start to assemble some really basic frameworks, but just by thinking about the key elements or the key parts that go into these things. So like with a bike or with an apple pie, you can just start listing all of the individual parts, all of the individual elements. You might only have a handful, 4, 5, 6, you might have 10, but you can start exploring them. And that's how you're going to build your analysis. So if you take a look in the week 6 module, a few other things we can practice with, a couple of images. And then, like I said, a video clip from a pretty famous movie called Lost in Translation that's like 17 years old, but it still seems like a contemporary movie to me. We can analyze those things as well. So and I want you guys to kind of do this individually. I'm not going to walk you through the images or the clip, but let's just follow the same basic procedure. So the subject has been selected for you. You have two photos, like photography. Well, one's actually a still image from a movie. The other is a photograph. And then the third thing is an actual scene, an extended like 3 or 4 minute scene from a movie. So you follow the same procedure. You know what your subject is in each case. You should have a title, I think, for each one of them. But you can provide your own title if you don't see one. Once you've identified that subject, think to yourself, okay, what does it do? Like, what is the function? What is the purpose of this thing? And then you can start assembling your framework. So again, we can use these tools for works of art. We can also use them for mechanical sort of everyday items. It really doesn't matter. The procedure does not change. The only thing that will change will be your subjects of analysis and, of course, your frameworks, because you'll have different elements or different parts. So my background as an English major was to analyze works of literature. And you guys already know how I went about doing that. We've done some of it ourselves in our discussion posts. When we analyze literature, in order to understand what the work of literature means, we have to analyze individual elements. That means setting, characters, figurative language, all the stuff that we talked about several weeks ago, all those narrative elements, those are the individual elements or parts that I would be exploring if I wanted to analyze a novel or a poem or a short story or one of our essays. But of course, if you're analyzing a movie, you're going to have different kinds of parts. You're going to have camera work, and you're going to have acting, and you're going to have sets, and you're going to have costumes, right? And if you're doing a car engine or a computer, you're going to have all of the pieces that go into those mechanical devices. So again, our topics will change, our frameworks will all be different. But once we get these basic skills down, once we kind of understand how to assemble a framework, we'll be able to apply these skills to virtually anything. So practice with those two visuals. Well, all three of them were visuals, but the movie clip and the two still images. Practice with those. Go ahead and practice with the bicycle, the apple pie. Just look around your house. Try to find anything else that you might be able to analyze. A computer, a TV. You can also analyze people, of course, and when you're sort of identifying key elements or individual parts, those might be personality traits, they might be physical traits, they might be parts of a person's background. Again, it kind of depends on your angle, what you're trying to understand and explain, but by identifying the key parts and then building a framework around those parts and their relationships, we're going to accomplish our goals no matter what we're working with. So let's start practicing, and our final bit of practice for the week will come in the form of your next discussion post. So we only have one piece from 50 essays to read this week. It's a piece by Joan Didion called On Keeping a Notebook. I'm guessing a lot of you probably aren't that familiar with Joan Didion. She's a famous writer. She used to be a journalist. She's also written a lot of fiction. Nonfiction. She's really a versatile writer. She's very talented. She's good. She's famous in, circles like the ones that I travel in. She's not necessarily like a celebrity, I wouldn't say. I mean, she's not Stephen King or like J.K. Rowling. She hasn't quite achieved that level of like sort of pop, that sort of pop culture status. But amongst writers and people who teach and study writing, she's held in very high regard. She's either dead or very close to death. She's very old. But anyway, you guys don't care about all of that. We are reading a piece by her that's a little challenging, and that's why I only gave you one reading assignment for this week. Just do your best with it. I want us to use it as an opportunity to analyze a written text, but we can also kind of analyze a process. We can analyze not just, objects or items. Like I said, we can analyze people, places, we can even analyze concepts or processes, things that, sort of step-by-step processes, the sorts of things we might see in instruction manuals. Didion, in some ways, is sort of talking about the process of keeping a journal and writing down observations and impressions. She's a professional writer, okay, obviously, keep that in mind. So, and read through the prompt for our next discussion post. There's a little more to it. It's a little more complex than some of the previous prompts because, again, Didion's talking about how writing in her notebook helps her as a writer. But she's not very direct, and her structure is kind of weird. You'll notice that she does not really use a chronological, linear narrative sequence. She's a little bit difficult. She's kind of weird. That's part of her charm, I think. But it's not a super easy essay to understand on your first reading. So just be patient. If you have questions, that's okay. Just try to answer my questions and the prompt to the best of your ability. But I'm kind of walking you through how I want you to analyze her text. And we're practicing the same techniques that I've been talking about here today. We're identifying our subject. We're constructing a framework by looking at individual parts and elements. So we can do it with Didion's essay, and we can do it with virtually anything else. But practicing is key at this early stage. So we'll spend the rest of this week practicing. If you have questions, let me know. And then next week, we will start on process analysis. And I'll talk more about that. I think some of you will find it fun. I can't speak for all of you, but this is sometimes regarded as one of the more fun essays that we write. So hopefully that's encouraging, and I will see you next week.